Hey there, the unretired engineer coming at you today again to talk about engineering and projects and sometimes science fiction. But today we're going to be talking about SBIRs again and specifically some more experience and some thoughts that I have on SBIRs, which I spent a fair amount of my career working on and around. So there's there's a thread that goes through the SBIR. A lot of their enemies will say, "Oh, well, you turn out a lot of these companies, then they are SBIR mills, and essentially they're just companies, small companies, obviously, of often PhDs and techs and whatnot with a small office, and essentially they write proposals, get contracts, and nothing ever comes. They do a phase one, a phase two, and nothing ever comes out of it. And I can't argue that this happens, but the reality is there's always going to be a hit and a miss, and we're gonna be talking about that, right? So the reality is, in episode one, I talked about the delidding machine, which was the perfect SBIR. It essentially, there was a topic, a company proposed on it, they did a phase one, very good. Phase two, a piece of equipment came out that was used for over a decade. And that equipment then went on to be sold to a large number of other companies. And the amount of money that that solution saved for the government was immensely more than the SBIR cost, and probably was worth the whole value of the SBIR program for that whole year that it was originally out there. So it was a hard, very hard success, right? There's also the second one I talked about where the project was a success, but it failed as an SBIR in that it really never chained up to a production solution. But the narrow technical solution that was developed actually got the Navy out of a problem that it had, even though the topic that it was written and the solution was developed against had nothing to do with that solution. It just was a kind of happenstance that by discussion, people got together, they found that solution, and it worked. And again, saved the Navy a great deal of money and paid for that program, and probably much of that year's SBIR budget all in one fell swoop. And that project went on and sold other equipment. It's not that it just went away, it just never scaled up. But the reality is that a large number, probably the majority and a large majority of projects never get beyond phase two. And why is that? And why is it that there tend to be companies which get a fair number of SBIRs and never turn them into a phase three or an ongoing product? And the Congress has called for research on this, and they call them SBIR mills, and the reality is it's not really. That's not really what's happening here. It is much more intrinsic in the project, in the program itself. It's not gamification of it, rent seeking, or any of that. So anyway, that's what I'm going to be talking about a little bit more. So the data, which I will put up on screen, is that there was a study that looked at commercialization. And, essentially the top 1% of winners got 16.8% of all phase two proposals, right? The top 7%, 46% of all awards. And the reality is that the high frequency winners commercialize more per project, not less. So companies that won multiple awards tended to commercialize them more. And the top tier, 60% greater than the rest of the projects. So the reality is that the criticism of SBIR mills is really not appropriate. It just is an appearance, and there can be, times when it feels very real when it really isn't. And the problem really about transition is not engineering, it's not R&D, it's really about overall economics and commercial reality. So to move on, but just as a note, right, there was a canonical mill called Radiation Monitoring Devices. And they were accused of being a mill, but reality is it was never more than 16% of their revenues. It wasn't like they were living off of SBIRs. They were just getting a large number of them, and they were not turning them into commercial products on a steady beat. We'll talk about that. So, the issue really is that most of the time a proposing firm is already in that market. And the success is that they're in that market, they understand the market, they know the boundaries of success. And that's what happened with the delidding machine. They were in that business, maybe not directly in that business, but they were in the general business. They knew it was a problem. They understood the metrics of the problem, and they solved it. And then they were able to sell that product to the rest of the market because the Navy had provided them the seed funding, and then the Navy had also allowed them to demo the equipment that they'd given to the Navy and show that it really worked. So, the Navy problem created the market, the company created the solution. The market then basically pulled the solution out and created a solution. Very clean, but it's also relatively unusual. So what really the phase 3 in a program is supposed to be is other people's money. You could say with the lidding machine, that's really what happened, right? It was other people's money that pulled the phase 3. It worked, right? It wasn't an explicit phase 3, but it still happened. But, the reality is that the firm took on the risk, and they took that risk on because they understood the market and were willing to put themselves out there and spend money to sell the equipment. And the Navy had helped them with that because the equipment now existed and could be demonstrated. That solved all of that. But, the reality is, there's it's that take up time, all of that. That can be a big risk, right? And the thing about a commercial company coming in and buying that technology or buying the IP, or the Navy program having a problem that the technology solves, and then basically that program buying the solution, which you could say, my second project was kind of somewhat representative of. Those are actually edge cases. They're not really the standard. So, a lot of the criticism about SBIR mills is really against a case that is not really all that realistic. So, the whole point is the SBIR was supposed to, one, feed money to R&D, small firms, innovative firms who could solve problems, bring them to the market, be more cost effective, etc. But the reality is the valley of death is not bridged by a technical demo. When you get out of phase 2, one of the things is it's a relatively narrow solution. There isn't a lot of money in a phase 2, a couple of $1 million at max, and often much less than that. And the reality is that's not a lot of money. And, it's not going to solve a big problem. It's going to solve a fairly nuanced problem. And the reality is taking that solution from the point of engineering solved to a product solved is a big leap in most cases. It's not really one that is easy. And that's why the whole idea of, well, the big program swoops in and pulls it, or a big commercial entity swoops in and funds it. That's why where that model comes from, but they're pretty unlikely. And the reality is when you are a small company, betting on a program, even if you believe very strongly in it, is a bet the company type thing. You're going to go to the bank, investors, you're going to say, I want, more money. Here's this, whiz bang device. Everybody gets liquored up, go off, and it doesn't sell, and suddenly your company's bust. And the technology is most likely going to either go to somebody else as part of a IP portfolio, or it's just going to evaporate into the ether. So, if you bet, there's a good risk you'll go bad. If you don't bet, then you're a small company, and you just did an SBIR to phase 2, you didn't turn it commercial, you're an SBIR mill, right? Well, and there's also the big problem that, a lot of companies, if they want to do intrinsic growth over time, which a lot of founders would like to do, the reality is when you're a small business, the FAR rules on accounting, all the rest of that, are not required. It's one of the advantages of SBIR and being a small business. Your accounting rules are different. Once you go beyond a certain point, that's no longer true, and you have to make the decision: am I a commercial firm, or am I going to do military work and follow the FAR rules, which are really focused on cost plus type projects, right? And that in itself is another big problem you have, because now you essentially institutionalize the whole point of expecting to be paid for your work and get a fixed fee on top of your work. You can't commercialize. You're not betting not making big bets any longer. You're totally against the ethos of the FAR rules, and that becomes a big problem. So you're in a trap. Big bet, you can fall off, fail and go away. If you don't bet, then you look like a mill, and if you grow too big, then suddenly you can't make money anymore, and you have to stay small, and so you're in a bit of a trap. So from the inside, I worked for a company called SatCon. No longer exists. Basically a power electronics company had started in the world of building momentum wheels, actually for satellites, SatCon, satellite control. So they had started momentum wheels. They had basically done a lot of work on trying to create spinning power storage for homes and for other places for very high reliability, quick turn on, turn off type power. And they'd done a lot of that. They had expertise in permanent magnet machines, in power control, circuitry, and the whole nine. So a big stack of technology. And they wanted to grow, right? So, and they were attracting venture capital. This was the 1990s, the big run up. So, we always said, everybody thinks we're a web company, an internet company, even though we were a hardware company. So, I worked there. I ran a government grant program, which is actually a cost share between the company and the government, and for 4 years. But I also, because of my experience on the other side in SBIRs, I also wrote proposals, and I won quite a few phase 1s and then turned quite a few of those into phase 2s. But none of them had gone to phase 3 by the time I left the company. So, well, am I the SBIR mill? The reality is you have to think about time. One is you have to get the proposal. That is the topic in. You have to assess it. You have to do all the work to say, okay, what would I do against this? And then you have to propose, wait for the selection, go through the contracting, and then do phase 1. That's 2 years at least, right? The reality is that's about 2 years. Then it's phase 2. Phase 2 is you have to have shown it worked. They have to agree that it's good enough to go on and have the money to go on, and then you have to do it. The project itself could be a couple of 3 years. The selection process is 6 months on the minimum. So, you're talking by the time you come to the end of phase two, you're, in the order of 4 to 5 years on, which in my case was about the time I left the company. And so we had been working on a series of phase threes and how to fund them and what to do. And the company itself had been really working at this. And that was one of the reasons that we were very successful, because we were bringing in VC money. The company had bought a small permanent magnet motor, that is a small firm, as in it wasn't a very big firm. And the motors they built were in the fractional horsepower to a few horsepower. In fact, if you remember BattleBots, the TV program, though a lot of those BattleBots actually used magnet motor machines, which was a SatCon company. They also had a company that did materials in hybrid microelectronics and built circuits for commercial and military. And they later bought a company that built PV inverters at the mid-scale. And one of my last programs was basically to develop an inverter that would be built by that company, that would then eventually go to and compete against, at that point, the Germans, but also the Chinese. And my read of the situation, which after I left, is that one of the problems they had is they made a fair bet that that PV market was going to take off, and they got rolled over primarily by the Chinese coming into the PV market and basically completely dominating the inverter market for home PV. The Germans had dominated up to a certain point, and then the Chinese took most of that market in the United States. And that is part of, I think, what drove SatCon into the ground eventually. And it went bankrupt and sold off the parts to other players. So, Congress response to the SBIR mill, all of this and complaints. So, basically they have, after a lapse of about 6 months, the program has been reauthorized. They put in some new rules, one about cost matching to try and drive the model, particularly in phase three, the model back to this cost share, bringing in money from the outside, which I don't really see as being, all that realistic, since I don't think that was the problem to begin with. They also put a lot more money on the table for big wins. So instead of this relatively small amount of money and none for phase three, they basically put up a $30 million fund potentially for post-phase two efforts to bridge them. Again, it's certainly going to cause, there are going to be wins. It's going to happen. The problem is I don't really know that it's going to solve the problem, because most of these programs, again, it's cost matching, so 100%. I worked in that world at SatCon, 100% match on the main program I was working on. And it was always a struggle to figure out how to do that and to make it, one, what is a match? How real is it? And there was a bunch of, gaming. I mean, it was all fair enough, but it was sometimes a struggle to figure out how to make all of that work. And, the reality is it's going to select for companies which have the ability to pull in that kind of money. And is that necessarily the group of companies that are going to be the most, innovative and push forward? It's not always, your hope is there's enough companies, enough ideas that it'll all wash out. But it's not necessarily going to be, the big win that you think it's going to be. And there is also one of the other rules is a lifetime cap. So about how many SBIRs a company can win. And the reality is, whenever you put in bureaucratic rules, then you just basically make it that bureaucrats, i.e. lawyers, are going to game those rules, and the companies will simply, disestablish and reestablish under a new name, and it'll be, there'll be a new company, and off they'll go, and it won't really have changed. Whenever you put this kind of system in place, all you're doing is gamifying it for a certain class of people, and they're going to game the system. I think it is not necessarily all bad, and you're not necessarily changing anything. It's just that in a system like this, one of the issues, and one of the things I talked about last time, right? The reality is the SBIR really ought to be treated more like a VC funds and be looked at as, yes, we're investing, yes, we have specific things we're looking for, yes, but accept the fact that a lot of them are not going to succeed, that some of them are going to succeed, and a few of them are going to succeed really well, and use that as your metric, not try and make it so that some set percentage of this, some other percentage of that. Again, those kinds of hard and fast rules just don't work in the real world. So, at the end, right, go back to what I said. High frequency winners commercialize more, not less than low commercial. So the reality is a lot of the complaints really are very based on wrong appreciation of the optics. The real failure mode in the SBIR program is structural, not gaming. The reality is making that jump to a commercialized solution is very path dependent. You have to have the right solution at the right time with the right need appearing and all that for it to really work. And, that rarely actually happens. So, you're always going to get more misses than hits. And the other thing you ought to really take into account is that usually no technology development is a total waste, because you've trained people, you have generated IP that will go out into the world in one way or another and enrich the overall environment, and that's a good thing. You may say, well, it was a lot of money to get that, but, it's not necessarily a waste, and maybe eventually it'll come back and be as part of a big win that might not have happened if it hadn't existed. Again, SBIR really should be considered as a portfolio of investigations, an investment in the future, not as kind of individual wins. Trying to put in rules like matching and whatnot just narrows the number of companies who are going to be able to play. It just kind of makes it more so that you're going to be paying more lawyers to figure out what the rules mean and how to meet the letter of the rules. So that's not the biggest win in the world. So anyway, that's my read on the SBIR and kind of the recent updates and changes, and why the SBIR mill is not necessarily the right view of it and the right criticism. There might be other criticisms, but that certainly isn't one that I think holds a lot of water. I'll be back probably next week to talk about some of the things that evaluators, which I was in previous life, what we read for and why we value certain things. So come back and watch me then. So if you hit the subscribe, and send me any comments. And I'll be back at you with something else soon. Cheers.